Thank you so much. I think, Andrew, you have said those words before. And there's a few things in there. Had it down pat. Very good. Well, good evening to all of you. And I understand that we also have some French visitors. So I want to say bonsoir and also point out, je ne parle pas français. So I'm sorry, it's all going to be in English at this point. But anyway, I also want to thank Anderson House, Andrew, the Society of the Cincinnati, for having me here. I should give a special shout out, I guess, to the society up in Massachusetts, because actually there's a lot about Massachusetts in my talk today. So perfect timing for all of this. I got into this looking at this topic because so often in our textbooks and everything, you come back to this, Congress decides to create an army. And I was always left, what? Did they do this in a fit of absence of mind? They just woke up one day and said, let's create an army. What were some of the origins for that particular thought? What is it that led them to make such a profound step? And where can we see it? And what are the ends of creating such an army, and what were the ways and means by which they created it? And as we look at this, what does this tell us about what we should know about an armed force, an American armed force, and its relationship to our government, to the concept of rights and the rest? So I wanted to get a little bit more into that. And furthermore, to get into it, because sometimes the Army is called the first national institution. The first organization first met truly, along with Congress, I would say, of unifying the colonies and putting them into action together for a continental mission. So this is what I wanted to get into on all of this and take you through with me on this step. So it is more about the founding, and it's going to be more of a civil military talk as I'm looking at the political aspects of this, or the ideological aspects of creating an armed force and what it is supposed to do and how it is to be regulated, and to look then at that authorization and what it was meant to do. It is not to be really a talk about the military organization getting into the nitty-gritty, especially when Washington confronts the Army for the first time up in July in Cambridge, July of '75. This is more about that civil military component in this. So indeed, when we start talking about that, we get into Massachusetts. All right, why did the Continental Congress establish an army when it did? Looking at April to June of 1775. So yes, we are in the 250th, anniversary of the creation of the Army. At this point, before there is a declaration, before there is a founding of a nation. And by the way, I guess I should give a shout out. Yes, the 250th anniversary of the founding of the Navy, and within the month, the founding of the Marine Corps. No Air Force yet. Sorry, that takes a little bit of time. Okay. So why then? They had already been contemplating this issue about how to defend yourself by arms when they're looking at what has been occurring in the earlier part of this revolution. So Great Britain already had troops, regular standing army troops in the American colonies at this point. They had been left behind after the French and Indian War, what is also called the 7 Years' War, set up primarily in the frontiers. But as there was more and more reaction against the colonists to the moves by the imperial government, that are clamping down on some of the colonial practices about their own rights and liberties as they see it. And then the British Army had been brought out. The Empire or the ministers had brought that army in to the cities, primarily into New York City, Boston, and the like. In other words, starting to move armed forces among the greater civilian population. So looking at that possibility of a threat with this. So this is well before there's Lexington and Concord. This escalates a bit up by the coercive and the intolerable acts in 1774. So at that point, that had been after that so-called Boston Tea Party, there had been these actions. There is more of this push and shove by American colonists who are British subjects, who are now pushing and shoving against British soldiers. So they both belong to the empire. They're both supposedly British. But what we start to see here is they don't start to see it simply as being British subjects who are pushing against British troops. No, these are ministerial troops. And we see this in the language, in the words that they use, is this kind of pushing back or separating from the celebration of the troops. They are ministerial troops. They're used by the ministers who are telling King George what to do, and that is to clamp down on the king's subjects. So they've been doing all these petitions and everything else saying, King George, we are swearing our allegiance to you, but you've got people in Parliament and the ministers who are acting against your own subjects. And now they have gone a step further, using then the British Army forces as ministerial forces against your own subjects. That really was brought home to him after the coercive, or what the Americans called the Intolerable Acts in 1774. So of course, by this time, they're starting to build up their militias, talking about arms and ammunition, drilling their militias more, thinking what will happen if we have to defend ourselves if these ministerial troops are indeed deployed against the king's own subjects. These people don't like standing armies. They never have. That's actually a very British concept, not to like standing armies. But of course, Britain had indeed created one since the end of the 17th century. And now parts of that standing army are indeed being deployed among these civilian populations. So they come back right up to it as they're thinking about this, and they're going, we got a British army. There's at least 8,000 regular troops among us. How are we to confront them and contain what they may be doing to us at some point? So, it's a well-trained army against them. And what do you have? American militia. And each of these colonies have militia, but they're different command structures, different numbers. Their drilling is different. They are certainly not fully unified yet in terms of a military pushback. Now, of course, they believe in their own aptitude of arms. Americans always believe, hey, give us a war, we can get it done in a year. Just, we know what to do in all of this. Discounting the need for a professional army. All right. Well, this starts to play in. They're saying, is that really enough? And here's where we come back to Massachusetts. Before Lexington and Concord, on the 5th of April, 1775, the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, which was an extra legal body, I want to point out, because under the Intolerable Acts, General Gage, who is the Governor General of that area of Massachusetts, had shut down the regular assembly in Massachusetts. Okay, Massachusetts Assembly Act, it's gone. So they had moved out from Boston and reassembled to talk about what's the next step. Okay, what are they doing? 5th of April, that Congress then passed its articles, rules, and regulations for the Army that may be raised. Maybe. This is a preemptive step. They certainly hope it's not needed, but it may be raised for the defense and security of our lives, liberties, and estates. It is to be a defensive force to defend the people's lives, liberties, and states, which at that point is what they are defining under the British Constitution as what is due British subjects. They create these articles, and most are copied from the British Articles of War. Why, reinvent the wheel if you have to? Borrow what you need. So they've got that, but think about that. The first thing they do is say, before we do any kind of military force, we've got to have rules and regulations by which to control it, regulate it, have it under our control. That's the first step. A few days later, the 8th of April, Massachusetts Congress approved a plan to create a New England Army to defend American rights. So they create a plan. You start with rules and regulations. Next, you've got a plan. And Massachusetts would provide most of the proposed troops. Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island would provide others. So it's not just to be a Massachusetts force, but to pull in the others, right? They've got it set. The word is out. And then they are attacked. So at that point, you had set these things in motion, but you don't actually deploy them until attack. Thus, it is again defensive. They had been attacked first. So after Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts authorized what became known as the New England Army of Observation, manned by militia, bringing them all together, plus volunteers who are joining it now, and they are meeting in Cambridge as they kept watch over the redcoats, or the ministerial troops, in Boston. And it is there by the 23rd of April that it is truly put into execution under the command of Artemas Ward. Okay, so it's not a full-fledged provincial army, but it is a regional force. Now, I come back to looking at all these things, and as we go forward, what is the end for creating an army here? And what are the ways, which are the courses of action, and the means, the instruments or resources by which to meet that end? The first end or goal or objective here is to defend and secure the lives, liberties, and estates of British subjects in America. That's the first part. It is not about separation. It is not about independence. But they are under threat by the army against subjects. And they have got to defend themselves. And they see that defense of their lives and their liberties in particular, their rights, as those guaranteed by the British Constitution and by the charters that the king had given in creating those colonies. That's what they did. So what are the ways and the means in all of this? First is you got to strengthen the Union. It's not enough that it's only one group doing this. Got to pull everybody together, because there had been success before politically and economically through boycotts and petitions. Do this for the military as well. But what do? You want to form an army. The army is the instrument. It is a means. But how do you create that army? It is by civil instruments. So by governments and by law, by a due process of law. And what we see is how in these various ways that they explain what they're doing, that they are doing this of and for the people and the people's rights. So due process of law must be maintained in creating a military force and in deploying that force. Comes very, very clearly through these first. So that brings us to the next one where we see some, oh, by the way, just showing you again on these images real quick. Of course, this is just a cartoon about that British force coming out of Boston, marching to Lexington, and then into Concord, being met by these very noble militiamen to start this war. But what do? Founding the Continental Army by civil means. What does this mean? Coming out of Massachusetts again in here. They had come in 16 May, signed by Joseph Warren, who was leading that provincial Congress at the time. And it is read before Congress on the 2nd of June, 1775. Now look at what they have to say to move a step further. We are compelled to raise an army. We are forced to do this. We don't choose, if you will, we are compelled It is something that we have seen other times in American and in the deployment of our troops, that we are forced to deploy our troops. We are forced to go to war. We have been attacked, and we are going to attack back to defend ourselves. We are compelled to raise this army. But no, with the assistance of other colonies, that we are going to be able to defend not just us, but all America from these further butcheries and devastations by our implacable enemy. It is our enemy now. Not just British soldiers, not just ministerial troops. They have truly become the enemy. But note again, the sword in all free states should be subservient to the civil powers. The sword subservient, if you will, to the pen, to the law. They make it. Now, they take this a step further there as they see these interconnections. It is the duty of the magistrates to support the army for the people's necessary defense. But note, magistrates are elected to represent the people's interests. So the magistrates are elected for the people. The magistrates create an army that in turn is to defend those people. They are all interconnected. Okay, so they are to do it. But given all that, given that interconnection, that it all comes back to the people and their rights, they still, as they say, tremble at having an army, even though it consists of our own countrymen, established here without a civil power to provide for and control them. The two aims, it's the civil power that gives them the men and the material and the money. And that is the civil power that also regulates and controls that force. That is very clear from the beginning. Now, right then, after they say that point to Congress, given that the civil power is so important, the next paragraph was actually, by the way, since we've got a provincial Congress and we're having these problems with Gage, and other colonies are having problems with their royal governors right now, who are starting to close down colonial assemblies as they resist, your advice is really wanted about how we are supposed to create true civil governments in this new era. Okay, so they're already coming back, because if civil power must be in control, then we've got to make sure that the civil power is right. Then once they get that done, they come back to, here it is, the army is now collecting, and it is collecting for the general defense of the right of America, not just the rights of Massachusetts, not just of New England, but they've made it general for all of America. What happens in Massachusetts is going to happen elsewhere. So they ask, we would have you consider the propriety of your taking the regulation and general direction of it. Think about what an ask that is. Congress, at that point, the Continental Congress is not a government. It is a league of delegates to create unified action among the colonies, and to be able then to petition and work against the British government in unity. They're sending out the various petitions. They're sending out advice to the colonies. They're doing all this stuff, but they're not a government. And yet in asking it to do this, it's essentially asking Congress to take on a governmental power. And it's one of the things that I see with this is, if it's not a government, how does Congress become one? And one of the steps in becoming one will be taking command and control of an army and what it has to do. And then it has to work with the colonies that become states to continue to do everything it needs to provision and control that army. So it's part and parcel. They're working together. There is a symbiosis between creating or founding an army and founding a nation with its new governments into this. So it's a big task. Well, indeed, then Congress did appoint a committee to consider the request, came back on the 7th of June, saying, here's our recommendations with it. And their first recommendation, which they sent out on the 9th of June, was that advice about civil government. Okay, here's our advice about creating that. And then on the 10th of June, John Adams proposed to Congress that the troops laying siege at Boston be deemed a Continental Army. Right then and there. So first civil government, then Army. Their process. And indeed, Congress put out requests that very day to the colonies to furnish the American Army before Boston with powder and the like. There you've got that step. All right, but they've got to go further, right? They move on. So we're back up to Massachusetts. Again, thank you, Society of Cincinnati and Massachusetts, for supporting this talk. Appreciate it. So on the 14th of June, Continental Congress adopted the forces at Cambridge and authorized 6 companies of riflemen from Pennsylvania, 2 from Maryland, and 2 from Virginia. Why? For the support and defense of the liberties of America. So within all of this and doing this force, we're starting to also see that transformation of being British subjects into American subjects, ultimately into American citizens, step by step through this process. Okay. And this is where some people in interpreting this say this is the first national institution in these calls out to all of these other colonies to support this Continental Army. Now they take it a step further. You create an army, that's fine. You adopt all those forces up in Cambridge, but you need a leader. So on the 15th of June, Congress elects George Washington to be the commander-in-chief. That he is elected by Congress to this position. He takes a day and he accepts it on the 16th. I think, I always think this is when he has to go right back to Martha. Want to tell you just, the promotion I just got, what I'm going to be doing here. And then once he accepts, Hancock, as president of Congress, signed Washington's commission. So again, it is by Congress that he is elected. It is by Congress that he is commissioned. Here is that next step up, not by any one colony into this. The next day, the 16th of June, by the way, they established the senior officer and staff officer positions. Critical. We have this tendency to think about creation of the Army and we go right into the line units. All right, let's talk about the generals. Let's talk about the commanders. Let's talk about the regiments who are going to do the fighting. Those are all absolutely essential, yes. But they've created an army and they want to create a regular army. And what do you need for a regular army besides its authorization? What makes it regular? Now, by the way, note, this is not a standing army. A standing army is one that stands in peacetime. They made it very clear from the beginning that they're going to create a more professional army. It will be a regular army, but it is an army for the duration of the war that has just started. Okay, we've got that concept. It'll be after 1783 where they've really got to take into account, do we take this regular force, build it up, and make it a standing army? But they do it with the senior officer, and I've got to say, this is what you do. First of all, you got to have an adjutant general. All right, this is the chief administrative officer of an army. Critical. Staff officer, all right? Then quartermaster, commissary general, paymaster, very important. Pay is a big issue right now for the military. Commissary of musters, staff officers. And there's staff officers out there going, you bet we're important to a regular army. Give us credit. Because an army works on paperwork, as we all know, as well as by arms. We've got this. They do it. So that's one part of making it a regular army. 17th and 19th of June, Congress chooses the first 4 major generals: Artemus Ward, Charles Lee, Philip Schuyler, and Israel Putnam. Okay. 22 June, there are 8 brigadiers. They are allotted in proportion to the number of men contributed by each colony. You give us more men, you can get more brigadiers. Okay, hey, sounds like a fair deal. As they are doing all of this, please remember that New England Army of Observation is becoming this Continental Army just at the very same moment it's fighting a battle at Bunker Hill, okay, which was on the 17th of June. And indeed, then by the time Washington gets up there on the 2nd of July and takes command on the 3rd, that army has come back from Bunker and Breeds Hill, back into Cambridge, and he takes command and starts putting it together. And that's not the part I'm getting into today, obviously, for civil military, of what he needs to do to regularize the army on the ground. But as he's doing this, as he's starting to work all of this out, they have to go a step further. All right, we already say that they're at war because of Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill, though Britain would say they are simply in the midst of an insurrection. Okay, that they have become truly rebels in this. And that is indeed what General Gage had said in the 12th of June. They are rebels and traitors. In other words, they are outside the law. They are against the law. And once you make them rebels and traitors, you can use those ministerial troops against these subjects who are no longer within the law. And they're going, no, no, no. Again, we are operating by our understanding of law and our rights under this Constitution. And they bring this back up here. So what you've got is, look, government was instituted to promote the welfare of mankind. That's what government's about. This is coming back to their Enlightenment thinking, what had happened with the British Constitution, all of these things. This is where they're saying, we are just saying, we want you to operate in accordance with our history, our precedents, our Constitution with it. And they're going, this is what we are doing. So you look at this. Look, the legislature of Great Britain has been stimulated by a passion for power that is not justifiable. They know it's against the very constitution of that kingdom, what they are doing. So we're going to do it. This is what they're doing. They're trying to enslave us by the use of violence. And thus, we have to close with them. Close is a military term. Armies, regiments, whatever, are closing with each other to battle. So we've got to close with this, with our last appeal from reason instead of arms. We are doing all of this, but we could also step it all down, shut it down, if you will listen to our appeal of reason and grant your understanding of our rights as we see it in this. So that's what they're coming back to. We are doing this again for the preservation of our liberties. It's again, it is defensive. It is not because we're looking for glory by arms, and it is not, and they make that very clear, it is not for independence. It is not to separate. It is to guarantee ourselves under this. What is our rights as we see it? Our birthright. Protection of property and against violence already offered. They've made it there. So Congress, in what it has been doing through this, is transforming warring to defend rights and liberties within the empire, but they are moving to the fact that they ultimately will have to secure them via independence. They're not quite there. They want to defend it within the empire. Ultimately, the only way you can defend and secure them is outside of the empire. And in the process of doing that, again, we are seeing institutional metamorphosis. In other words, they are transforming the armed forces. They are transforming those colonial governments ultimately into what will be state governments. But they don't stop there. Whoops. Okay. They're coming back to articles of war. As I'd said before, if you're going to create an army, it's got to be a well-regulated army. There have got to be the rules. So they take off what they had already done and they borrowed these from what Massachusetts had done for the New England Army of Observation. Okay. And said, we can use those. And of course, that army's articles had been borrowed from Britain. As I said, take the precedents that you like and use them. They enacted the Articles of War, which became effective on the 10th of August, right? We've got this. What is interesting in these Articles of War is the preamble again. How do they explain doing this? All right, how do you justify creating an army? Because on the British side of it, it makes perfect sense to say this is a rebellion, this is an insurrection. And they're saying, no, we're going to teach you about the British Constitution as it applies to us. They are going, His Majesty's faithful servants. They're still swearing allegiance to His Majesty. At this point, we're still faithful, but we are reduced to a dangerous and critical situation by the attempts of the British ministry. The bad guys are the ministry. The bad guys are the advisors to the king. The bad guys are also Parliament. These are all the bad guys. And if we could just get through all the people giving you bad advice, dear King George, you would understand and you would defend us and confirm our rights. Okay, so he's going, where could we go with all of this? So unconstitutional, oppressive acts by the government, that's what they're fighting against. Hostilities already commenced. It is defensive. The war has begun. So this is why they're doing what they're doing. So every step of the way, they are explaining this. And they're doing this because you got a bunch of lawyers who are saying, if this goes to court, we're going to show it's by due process of law what we are doing. Make sure that we've got it. Now, the other thing that I like in here is just in moving along into this is what they do with the articles. The very first article is, who does join? Who becomes a Continental soldier, Continental officer? And their first point is they want everybody who joins it to, of course, swear to uphold these rules. And these are rules to accept the civil government's control of them and the like. But remember, this is an adopted army. They're not all new. So everybody joining that army by that August of 75 are going to swear to uphold and act in accordance to these rules and regulations. But there had been all of those with the New England Army. And they had contracts. They had signed recruiting contracts for that army, which included how long was their enlistment, what was the nature of punishments under those, all of those likes. And Congress, again, lots of lawyers here going, they had already signed a contract. We have to honor the contract of those soldiers. And we are showing here, we will honor those previous contracts, even as we move to the next step, due process of law. So we come there. So given that, you come to this recruitment. Take the next step. What it means to the soldiers who are joining. Now, I want to point out that that example of a recruiting poster is one that was actually sent out in 1799. It's a little bit later. I find this amazing that they must have had so many printed off and stored away. And when it was time to recruit for other events, 1799 is, of course, issues where Congress was actually starting to worry about whether the quasi-war with France, which was primarily a naval engagement moving in, might end up with land issues as well into it. That was one of the things that was coming up. So it actually is, because when we look at it more closely down in here, the captain who is recruiting for his force is a force that was in 1799. But it was somebody, by the way, who had actually served in the American Revolution as well. But this is a takeoff from those because we're talking raising under General Washington. Washington was in retirement at Mount Vernon at this time and was shortly to die by the end of 1799. But again, the liberties and independence of the United States. And that's going to be one of the big differences that we see here is that they take what they have developed in 75. And then once we have the Declaration of Independence in 76, Congress must reauthorize the Army. Okay, it is a new force under, if you will, a new contract with all those colonies that have now become states. So again, you have to the Army of the United Colonies becomes the Army of the United States. And they develop that. But no, one of the things that I find interesting is under the old articles is you've enlisted 1 year, unless sooner discharge, American Continental Army, and to conform to those rules and regulations. So let me ask you this, what's different in their enlistment oath in 76 and beyond? What's different? Oh, it's one of those silences you get with students. Yeah, please. Say what? Yes, it is talking about that it is coming right out and saying United States of America. It is named. Take it a step further. What else is there that was not there before? Excuse me? Okay, they've got this, obey the orders of Congress. It's not just talking about regulations established for the government of said army. So we're naming Congress. But note, there is an oath of allegiance to the United States in this. These are the new citizens enlisting in this army, giving an oath of allegiance to that. Profound step to take. And yes, then obeying Congress, obey orders of Congress, there is that civil control, the civil body in control of them. And then, of course, obey the orders of your generals and your commanders over you, which they don't all do, which is why they end up in courts martial and the like on occasions in there. But that is a profound next step. Army, government, Army and nation pulling together as we see in this evidence into this. Okay. So the revision, they then move in and they do revise the Articles of War. The first ones, of course, June of 1775. The next ones, Congress was a little bit busy at the very beginning. When they decided to declare independence, it was to put out the request to all of the different colonies to create new state constitutions, to set those up, put those together. They were giving advice. And by the way, Congress also started work on the Articles of Confederation. So again, we have this symbiosis is that they're creating Articles of War while they are creating Articles of Confederation. Moving beyond, so if we look at the context of how and what they're thinking, Army, government, Army, nation, how do you combine the two and make sure that nation and government controls the Army that is to secure this? They're going back and forth with them. In all cases, what we're seeing here with their Declaration of Independence, when you read that, when you look at their advice to the colonies to become states, and you look at the Articles of Confederation, you look at the Articles of War, in all cases, the revolutionaries were determined to operate by law, by their understanding of natural law, constitutional law, statutory law, and military law. This is how it's going to work. This is how they can defend what they are doing as just and right. to it. So with that, then we move. They have created these. They've started to create an army, and they're putting that army on the ground. You got to make sure we're doing well. Yep. So we look at some of the military. These are departments that are created by 1776 through this time. So they've already been at war for a year, and they are further regularizing this. So what we're seeing here, if anybody knows, what are these flags? Again, look back at history, get people involved onto this. This is the standard under which the British troops operated in the American colonies. It was also what was on British Navy ships at that time. That is the British Red Ensign. So the flag for those troops in America. What's this one? Rather similar to it, isn't it? At least in terms of the canton, in both cases. This is what's interesting. This is the flag that was created in December of 1775 for the American troops. Again, in this case, these troops on these two sides, both are within the British Empire. They're acknowledging it. Except that instead of this from the British Red Ensign, they've got the 13 stripes for the colonies, but still belonging to the empire at that point. The flag with the stars in that blue canton comes on the 14th of June, 1777. That's our Flag Day with it. It comes later. So when we look going into later into 75 and then into 76, most of the troops, of course, Washington with the main army or the Grand Army is down there in Massachusetts around Boston. We've got Philip Schuyler, who has created a northern force, a smaller one, around Albany, and he's under orders to be marching up to Canada. Not simply to invade it or take it, though that's part of this, but it is a carrot and stick approach, is invite the Canadians in to join, to be this 14th colony, ultimately a 14th state, but it's an invitation. Come in, we can offer you so much. And oh, by the way, we promise religious freedom for all of you French Catholics. That will be permitted. But come and join us in Congress, create your own governments. So that's the invitation, but in the midst of it, sending up an army. Was it fully to occupy? Yes and no. One of the plans was if the Americans could send up forces there, those forces could protect the Canadians they wanted to join them against ministerial forces. To do both. Not just protect the colonists below, but to protect the colonists above. They went in with way too few men for that, to make this work. It really would have depended on the Canadians fully joining. And they thought about it. But they wanted the Americans to prove that they could win against British forces before they fully committed. And unfortunately for the Americans, they lost at Quebec on the 31st of December, 1775. And they ended up hunkering down for a really miserable winter in Montreal and outside of Quebec, where not only the weather got them, but a smallpox epidemic took them down. Ultimately, the British started sending more troops in that were reaching Canada and sailing down the St. Lawrence by June of 1776, at which point the American forces retreated down the Richelieu Valley into the Lake Champlain Valley, ending up at Crown Point and Fort Ticonderoga. And that was pretty much the end of that. I will say that not everybody gave up on the idea, but it was there. But what I wanted to bring out for that first part, as I finish up on what's going on here, is that Congress again was believing in civilian oversight for what the military was doing. And Congress started this by setting committees to where the armies were. They sent a committee of Congress to Washington's main army in Boston, and they sent one up to Montreal to meet with the American forces up there, Montreal and Quebec. And that is, civilian oversight was absolutely essential. It is something, by the way, that continues to this day, sending congressional delegations out into Army operations. That is part of that civilian oversight. But the other thing that they did in the midst of all of this is that they also created a board of war. In January of '76, Congress was starting to realize that they could not run a war and an army by committee, purely by committee, that they needed another device by which to do it. They thought it in January. Finally, in June of 1776, in the midst of creating the new state constitutions and deciding on a declaration, they created a board of war, which would be then the major civilian oversight, civilian and military combined for oversight on the military. And I'd just like to point it out because it's kind of like the origins of the Pentagon, right then and there with that board of war. And for all of them then, as they move into '76, the plan is independence, new governments, confirming civil authority, defending American rights, which will be done through the successful prosecution of the war. And I think I'll stop there for questions and answer, whatever we can do, because we are, coming to that time. So the civil military foundations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mayer. If you do have a question, I would kindly ask that you please raise your hand and I will bring the microphone to you so our friends on Zoom can hear you. So I will open the floor up now.
First, thank you very much. It was brilliant and extremely interesting.
Oh, thank you.
I have just a question, and I'm sorry if my question is not, say, adequate. It's just, you mentioned the institutionalization of the American Army, but I would like to know about the training, because those men who constituted these forces, those new forces, where did they come from? They come from the people. They were British soldiers that were finally deserted or whatever. So the constitution of an army is also its equipment, its training. Right. So how did this happen? And especially in time of war, how much time did it take to have a more professional army? If I may say that.
Okay, it's a big question. It's certainly part of the other side of what is the Army doing while Congress is doing its part to found this Army. So first of all, part of it was with those staff officer positions that they are creating staff departments within this. So they had to first settle up, create the commissary, the quartermaster, all of these different groups that are to indeed see about provisioning this Army. So the quartermaster had basically at least two developments in it. One is the contractors is developing a contract system for the material that they need. Then you've got the recruiting and the paymaster, which is to get the men that you need as well within all of this. So they're starting to work on that side of it. And then Washington and his commanders are actually putting it into play on the ground. It took a long time to do this. They were the officers who were trying to regularize the Army on the ground were using a number of manuals that they had received from Europe, from both Britain and France, because France had already published a lot of manuals about creating and organizing and training an army. And certainly they were using those manuals as they began to set up their own forces. They did not get their own blue book until they had Baron von Steuben, or General von Steuben, who brought in the blue book to give us our actual directions for training the Army, and that's in 78. So 77, 78. 75, 76, this is an ad hoc army. It is experimental. It is using what they had learned with militias to train their troops. And some of the commanders in that early army had also served during the 7 Years' War in the American theater. And they were using their experiences with the British forces then to train their troops on the ground then. So it is it really, I keep saying ad hoc is the way to do it. It was not fully in place. In fact, when we look at it, the Army had its first establishment was in 1775. Second establishment was 1776 when they were training, changing the regiments to regularize this army. By 77, the third establishment is when you can say it's becoming more of a regular army. It is starting to move from just 1 year enlistments to 3 year or duration of the war enlistments, which means you are keeping your veteran soldiers who know what to do to be there to train the new recruits that are coming in for it. So early on, not much is there. It explains a lot of what happens on the ground and in battles, but they become more regular by 77. Thank you.
Hi. At that time, were there any other countries where the Army was responsible to and reporting to a legislature?
Well, you could actually say in some ways that was part of what they had learned from Great Britain, is that in setting up a standing army by the end of the 17th century in Great Britain, yes, the king is essentially a commander-in-chief with this, and he is the one who can say, wants to go to war and can deploy the troops. But he has to go to Parliament for the funding of those troops to get them to agree to provision an army. So we'd already seen that division of the powers that we see again as the Americans set their own up for civil control there. I am not as aware of it until you are starting to move into the end of the 18th century, into the 19th century, when you have wars of revolution in Europe. And then we start to see this coming more into play with European forces. Yeah.
Good evening, Colonel from France. Thank you for this very enlightening conference and dynamic also.
Thank you.
My question is on the impact of the creation of this Continental Army in the British minds. Do we know how?
Okay.
What was the reaction? Oh no, we are finished. The war will be long. I don't know. What was the impact on
Well, it further confirmed for Great Britain that this was an all-out insurrection, which Britain continues to call it. When we look at the history, Americans always say we had independence since July 4th, 1776. Declare our independence, lo and behold, that's what we have. By international law, that is not truly set until France recognizes it. By diplomatic, you usually have to have recognition by another nation to establish another country. So we do thank France for that recognition, that first recognition. Great Britain did not acknowledge the independence of the United States until the treaty in 1783. So through that entire period, they are looking at this as an insurrection with it, or twofold, at least originally, partly a civil war, okay, with colonial rebellion against Great Britain. And then when colonies go against colonies, part of that civil war. So they continued to think that they did not acknowledge then the legality of the Continental Army. They certainly didn't. One of the ways to do that is the refusal by some of the generals to call Washington a general and to deal directly with him over issues like the exchange of prisoners and other treaties, to call him a general because they didn't want to equate what the Americans had just created to what they have in there. So it's more confirmation of the insurrection, but by the time it becomes more regular and it is starting to have more of a pushback, and it is able to push back better, and again, after the alliance with France, at that point, Britain recognizes that it's got a full-fledged war against nations rather than just against a colonial insurrection at that point. And where we see that is that Britain starts to change its grand strategy about how to win the war. So up through 77 and the Battle of Saratoga, Britain was focused on saying we could stop the insurrection simply by isolating the New Englanders from the rest of the colonies, divide and conquer. After then we have the French alliance, there is the movement south that Britain specifically changes its strategy to say, let's go to the soft underbelly of the colonies south and move our way up from that. So there is a distinct change in the dynamics with it. And that's where we're seeing some of that recognition.
Thanks, Ika. Thanks for a wonderful presentation. I found your discussion of the relationship between the king and the colonists versus the ministers fascinating. Now at the time, they did have a prime minister, North, in the Revolution. Was he and the other ministers viewed as illegitimate somehow by the colonists? Could you tell us a little more, unpack that a little bit more? How did that relationship begin and how did it evolve? And I'd never heard that slant on it before.
Okay, well, this is something, again, that had been developing, and it is a good one that brings in this civil military component, is that there had always been problems, if you will, with Parliament, on what Parliament was passing for certain laws. And it becomes even more so when Parliament starts to pass laws like the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act, where they are specifically trying to tax colonists who say those taxes don't apply. And they start making that distinction between taxes that simply control trade versus taxes that are to produce revenue. And once they start making that distinction, they're going, taxes for revenue alone can only be done by our own assemblies. They cannot be done by Parliament. Parliament can control imperial trade, but not revenue. And that starts to make that split. And over time, then, as Parliament was passing these pieces of legislation, basically from 1763 on, is the separation of the colonists from Parliament. They get rid of them. Then, by the time you're coming back and you're talking about Lord North and you start talking about the Townshend Acts and the like, they're going, it's the ministers. It's not just Parliament anymore, it's the ministers who are supposed to be in control of various aspects of the empire. And they are the ones that are basically part of the Privy Council for the king. So they are advising the king. So the last thing they want to do at this point is specifically to decry the king. All right, that's treason. Your allegiance is to the king. Your allegiance doesn't have to be to Parliament. It doesn't need to be the ministers, but it is to the king. If nothing else, it's King George is on the pub. It's named of the pub down the street and you want to keep going there. Okay, that's facetious. But anyway, so through this whole period from the 1760s into the early 1770s, as the colonists were petitioning for changes in what the new imperial direction, they were generally operating against Parliament and minister, but they would always come back and say, we pledge allegiance to the king. And the hope is that the king, who is monarch of all subjects, would recognize that they are British subjects who should not be subjected to Parliament in which they have no representation. Here's that no taxation without representation part that starts to split them into this. The very last thing that they do that moves into separation is when they decry the king and say we no longer pledge our allegiance to the king. And if you look at that, that is definitely seen in the Declaration of Independence, because there's that whole laundry list of everything that the king did wrong. That was the final split. But up to that point, the colonists kept hoping that the king would clamp down on his ministers and say, the colonies have their own charters that were signed by previous monarchs, that we need to acknowledge their rights and their powers through those. And so that's the last piece in that separation. Is king didn't come through. Instead, what the king did is he followed Gage and declared them rebels and traitors. Fine, then we no longer have allegiance to you. So again, a defensive move, if you will.
Dr.
Good
Megan,
questions.
I do want to get to a few questions on Zoom very quickly. One, and these are two that came up multiple times.
Okay.
The first one is when Washington arrives in Boston, shortly after the Battle of Bunker Hill. I mean, the Americans had just been through it by the time that he arrives.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned that, Artemus Ward, Israel Putnam, they were, especially Putnam himself, he was heavily involved. What was the dynamic? What was the feeling? Did they welcome him with open arms, or was there sort of some animosity there when he arrives and said, oh, we have to take orders from you now when we were just through the ringer for all this time?
I have not seen a lot that would say they were appalled by this. I think they recognized the politics behind the appointment. It wasn't, and yes, politics are involved in appointments, as we know, for military officers, but for many of them, for coming in, first of all, Washington had experience in the 7 Years' War in the American theater. So it was not like sending somebody up who was a complete novice about war. He's got that respect for it, even though we could argue that Washington started the whole bloomin' war at necessity, but that's another story. So I don't think there was pure resentment against Washington, because they were the major generals. And Washington may have been commander-in-chief, but he was also a major general. So he's first among equals, almost, as he goes up and he works with them. And they recognize that they are still in command of their certain parts of the troops, but his plan is to try to unify them, to integrate them, to get them on the same platform in terms of training the men, the material, and the like. His bigger problem was more with some of the more junior officers, not with the general officers up there, because he went in there, and of course, the first thing he has to do is deal with actually a bunch of officers and recruits who generally had come up through the militia. And those militias in New England were not the same as the Virginia militia. The Virginia militia was much more hierarchical and organized. The Massachusetts militia was not. The men elected their own officers. How would you like that right now? That our officers would be elected by their men? What does that do to military discipline, if you will? And that's one of the first steps that he has to take, is to try to counter that element and to organize them. So I would say it's more as he starts to try to control and make regular the more junior officers and soldiers than it was the general officers.
And to dovetail into the next question, what was Washington's relationship with Congress? Because you said there was a lot of oversight there. What was the dynamic with that?
A lot to be thankful for in terms of Washington. As I said, he was commissioned by Congress, fully recognized that. And he made it one of his tasks that he would always communicate with Congress. So he's very good about the communications back and forth about what he needs, what he wants. He didn't always get it, but keeping them in track. And Congress was usually pretty good with him. There was a lot of this, the intermediaries and the communication between them. Furthermore, Washington was not just dealing with Congress, Congress also reached out to all the state governments because he's got regiments from each one of these states. And he is very much that. So I'm trying to think of not too anachronistic kinds of ways of looking at this all, but there are the commanders in the fields with the troops, and he certainly was one of those. But he was also, as commander-in-chief, a political commander who had to make sure that he was fulfilling what was required under civil control. So he made sure that every time he was asked by a commander, he made it very clear to some of his commanders, and I know he did this with Sullivan at one point coming back from Canada too, not just Schuyler, but with Sullivan, is that as he was asking for things, he said there were certain decisions I could not make alone, but they had to be confirmed by Congress, is to ensure that they were on the same wavelength in this. And remember, when Congress resigned, when Washington resigned, he resigned his commission to Congress. He handed it back to them with all of this. So there was this fact that ultimately he might be commander-in-chief of the Army. Congress is commander-in-chief of the American states. I made that clear. Yeah.
Perfect. And I think I saw that gentleman over your shoulder nod and smile
Ah,
a little bit.
okay.
Dr. Mayer, I think that's a great place to wrap up. Thank you very much for coming and speaking for us.
Thank you. You're great audiences.
You may be in the world.
Thank you. Thank you.
And as always, for your continued support of our mission. So get home safe, everyone. We'll see you next time. Thank you.